Damon Jacobs says this little blue pill has completely changed his sex life. And it's not the little blue pill you might be thinking of. The pill is Truvada, part of a new class of drugs called PrEP that prevents HIV infection 99% of the time if taken as directed. Jacobs, a therapist in New York City, says he takes the pill every single day.
It was a game changer for me, spending the first 2 decades of my sexual life constantly living with the fear of knowing I could become HIV positive.
PrEP is pre-exposure prophylaxis, which means you're trying to prevent infection. It blocks the ability of that pathogen, in this case HIV, from reproducing itself.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, one of the nation's foremost HIV experts, is the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. He says PrEP is an important step forward.
We found out in clinical trials that if you give this one pill of 2 drugs every day to an uninfected person, you can very dramatically diminish the likelihood that that person will be infected. We know that PrEP works. We need to implement to get more people to use it.
Dr. Fauci has been on the front lines of the battle against AIDS ever since the beginning.
I first started taking care of patients in 1981. We had our first drug in 1987. That's 6 years. We had our first effective combination of drugs in 1996. So I went a lot of years taking care of a lot of patients, almost all of whom died before we had effective therapy.
I came out in the late 80s, early 90s, and lived in San Francisco at the time where knowing people with AIDS and loving people with AIDS meant losing people to AIDS.
Any partners?
Certainly I was aware that people I had been intimate with were there 1 year, and the next year you hear like, oh, so-and-so died last year.
God, what's it like to hear that?
Strangely enough, when it happens enough times, I think I just kind of became numb. It just seemed like it was going to be this never-ending thing that I was going to have to be coping with for my entire life.
Can you imagine if PrEP was around back then?
I can't think of anybody who has died who wouldn't have taken PrEP if they had had the option to do so.
Now people do have the option, but not many are taking it. Fewer than 2,000 patients filled prescriptions in the last 2 years, according to data from over half the pharmacies in the country. Leading the charge against it, surprisingly, some AIDS activists. The multinational AIDS Healthcare Foundation has been vehemently fighting PrEP for the last 2 years. In 2012, its members urged the FDA not to approve the drug.
At this time, there simply is not enough evidence to establish safety and efficacy, not enough evidence to unleash PrEP into wide-scale use.
We believe that, based on our experience being the largest AIDS organization in the world and providing care to 300,000 people worldwide for over 27 years in many, many countries, is that the vast majority of people who take PrEP will not be able to remain adherent. If they're not adherent, there's the potential that the risk of HIV infection increases rather than decreases.
In other words, people on PrEP will stop using condoms, forget to take the pill, and become infected with HIV. Early studies did show that while PrEP was highly effective if taken every day, less than half of patients took it consistently. Dr. Fauci says you have to put that in perspective.
Those people are likely the people who would not be giving any protection anyway. So I think you don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Now, Fauci's agency is funding clinical trials to look at adherence rates among real patients who elect to take the drug, not just paid participants. Sarit Golub is overseeing the New York trial.
Over 95% of our patients report no problems taking the pills. In our first 4 months of enrolling, we already have a waiting list of 90 people, and we've enrolled 120 so far.
Why are people so interested in trying this?
I think it's a really exciting new strategy for preventing HIV, and it's been so long since we've had a breath of fresh air in HIV prevention. Folks are concerned that all of a sudden individuals are going to go out and start having a lot of condomless sex because they have this pill. It's akin to some of the negative concern that happened over the oral contraceptives when those were first made available to women. This idea that if we make this pill available to women, all of a sudden they'll start to go wild in some way. So I think that has been one concern that really has not borne out.
I think there's a big difference between an unplanned pregnancy and acquiring a potentially fatal disease. And there are adherence problems, I assume, even with birth control. There are unplanned pregnancies. So again, I don't think the analogy holds.
Why is there such a difference of opinion within the community as to how to tackle this?
Well, I think that in the whole area of HIV prevention, there has always been disagreement. For example, when we first developed proper therapies for HIV, people would say, well, now that you have therapy for HIV, then people are going to be more careless and go out and get infected. That's true, some might, but I would rather have a therapy for HIV and save hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives, than having no therapy, because some people, since therapy is available, might be practicing risky behavior.
Are we at a tipping point?
I think we are at a tipping point, because if you see the acceleration of infections, it started to plateau, it's starting to go down. We have had the misfortune as a generation of seeing one of the most devastating pandemics in the history of mankind. Now we have the opportunity for the next generation, my children, to see that point where we can actually rid the world of this pandemic.
That hope is now beginning to spread.
We've made a lot of progress, but we're not going to be happy until we end the epidemic, and we believe we can.
The morning of New York's Gay Pride Parade, Governor Andrew Cuomo announced his plan to end the AIDS epidemic in the city by 2020. He called for significantly lowering the price of PrEP. Right now, it costs around $13,000 a year, but it is covered by Medicaid and most insurance. AIDS activists applauded the move.
We think it's a very big deal because no government entity in the world has yet committed to ending HIV by a particular date, but we're going to have to move from a few thousand people who are now taking HIV prevention drugs to scores of thousands.
They took that message to the streets, demanding drug maker Gilead further reduce its prices.
Using Truvada for PrEP, for pre-exposure prophylaxis. Have you ever heard of that?
Damon Jacobs was there too, spreading the word about PrEP.
It's actually daily medication an HIV negative person can take to stay HIV negative.
Motivated by a recent encounter with a friend he hadn't seen in several months.
He looked at me and his face just dropped and his eyes got watery. And he said to me, I just tested positive 4 months ago. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me there was a way to stay negative? I would have taken it. And what could I say? Because he was right. I didn't tell him. I had failed him. The community, the prevention community had failed him. Nobody had gotten the message to this 24-year-old young man that PrEP was here, that he had a way of staying negative. Until we have a cure, we have this sort of daily pill. And that is when I really used my frustration and anger to get this message out there.
Adam May, Al Jazeera, New York.